I want to talk today about the emergence of ecological thinking and a modern environmental consciousness. The term ecology itself is a byproduct really of the 1960s. It's something that we take for granted. The ways in which we as human beings and other animals are embedded within a broader environment that involves both living and non-living matter. And this tendency to think about the connections between things, that is a critical aspect of ecological and environmental thinking, but it is a relatively new phenomenon. If we think about the origins of the scientific revolution up through the 1800s and 1900s, there's increasingly a trend toward specialization within particular fields, say chemistry, biology, geology. And scientists began to dig more deeply and deeply into these separate fields, but they weren't thinking so much about the interconnections between these fields. Well, ecological and environmental thinking is a way of thinking that looks at the connections between the various different scientific fields so that we can understand the bigger question of how things relate to each other and influence each other. How, for instance, the chemicals in the environment might impact biological processes within the human body. That is an aspect of ecological thinking, thinking about environmental factors and how they impact other factors within a particular area. So that's the topic of my discussion today. I call this Legends of the Fall, the emergence of ecological thinking. Hopefully this term, the fall, will become clear momentarily. If we think about how historians have written about the history of technology and science and the history of the environment, these are very much related fields, I think it's safe to say that the history of technology and science has been written by and large up until the 1960s as a kind of heroic story of mostly white men creating incredible things that make life better. In this case, the scientists, the engineers, the companies that produce new technologies, the governments that support new kinds of technological systems are coded as heroic. And they become seen in the way that the history of science and technology was traditionally written as the agents of progress and positive change. And basically, this is the way that people wrote about history of science and technology up through the 1960s, and to some extent today as well. This idea is still very much embedded within our culture, the tendency to see science and technology as instruments of positive change, and the scientists and engineers and politicians and corporate types who support science and technology as agents of positive progress. So that's to put it in biblical terms, we were kicked out of the garden. Human beings used their own wits to figure out their environment, to recreate that environment, in a sense, to get back to the Garden of Eden, but by transforming the world to make it more perfect. The history of the environment was written as a kind of negative mirror image of the history of science and technology. So that rather than science and technology making the world a better place, the history of the environment beginning in the 1960s was written by and large as a story about how science and technology were endangering the environment, making the world a worse place. So you might say the signs are reversed relative to the history of science and technology, the way it was traditionally written. Instead of scientists, engineers, the politicians, and the business people who are agents of progress and of positive change, they are now coded as agents of regress and negative change. And in this sense, the history of environment and the history of science and technology are the same, except the signs are reversed. In one case, the heroes are coded positive, the scientists, the engineers, and so forth. And in the other case, the heroes become the villains. But in both cases, they are determining the movement of history forward. Just in one case, it's positive. In the other case, the end result tends to be negative. Okay. Where did this increasingly negative perception of science and technology come from? We saw hints of that when we talked about Frankenstein. Frankenstein, I think, was a first indication that people had some doubts about whether or not science and technology was all it was cracked up to be, that perhaps there was a darker, satanic demonic side to science and technology that was leading us not to a utopia or better place, but perhaps a worse place. We also saw a number of emerging in the 1800s, particularly in Great Britain, which was the center of the first phase of the Industrial Revolution, a critique of modern industry and technology. William Blake, I have here in this slide, wrote about the dark satanic mills, that is to say, the dark satanic factories, which many people saw as an engine of progress and of modernity within Great Britain. For William Blake, those factories and the factory system and the slums and the cities that were built up around them, those weren't positive elements of change, they were negative elements of change, and indeed they were leading us to a kind of hell. Hence his term, the dark satanic mills. Now this long poem that William Blake wrote in the beginning of the first part of the 1800s was about Jesus Christ coming back to earth. And he comes back to earth in Great Britain, and he attempts to build a new Jerusalem. But he has to do so by destroying the modern world that industry has created. So again, my point is trying to trace out the development of a new way of thinking about science and technology, not as positive, but as negative. I'll just read you a little bit from his work, The New Jerusalem, written in 1808. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon her clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills? Already you begin to see a particular way of thinking that looks at the green pastoral world as idyllic, and the world of industry and production and factories as dark and satanic. Bring me my bow of burning gold, bring me my arrows of desire, bring me my spear, O clouds unfold, bring me my chariot of fire. I will not cease from mental fight, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand, till we have built Jerusalem in England's green and pleasant land. Not in the city, not a factory, but England's green and pleasant land. So utopia in this sense is a retreat from modernity, industry, technology, the factory, the modern city, all these things that many people saw as positive. William Blake is coding not only as negative, merely as negative, but as satanic and perhaps even demonic, as an illustration of the fall from grace. The technology, in other words, is not the thing that's going to save us. It's the thing that is the source of our damnation. Original sin. Charles Dickens, many of you probably have heard of Charles Dickens, also wrote about the new kind of industrial world that had emerged in the 1800s in England. And in particular, he wrote a book called Hard Times, among many others, in which he very much criticizes this modern industrial world that other people saw as very positive. The novel called Hard Times was about a fictional industrial northern English town called Coketown. And coke is the fuel that is derived from coal that is used to smelt iron. In other words, it is the fuel that fuels quite literally the Industrial Revolution. But for Dickens, this new world that Coke had created in Coketown was not somehow an agent of positive progress. It was leading us backwards to some sort of hellish, demonic place. I'm just quoting from Hard Times here. It was a town, Coketown, a town of red brick, or of brick that would have been red if the smoke and ashes had allowed it. But as matters stood, it was a town of unnatural red and black, like the painted face of a savage. It was a town of machinery and tall chimneys, out of which interminable serpents of smoke trailed themselves forever and ever and never got uncoiled. It had a black canal in it and a river that ran purple with ill-smelling dye. So a fetid, stinking, horrific cesspool. This is what modern technology and science has created, according to Charles Dickens. Again, I'm mentioning this to trace out the emergence of a kind of critique of modernity and a new way of thinking about science and technology that saw it leading us not to utopia, but to a kind of hell on earth. Another thing that influenced the negative view of science and technology and of modern industry in the Industrial Revolution was the phenomenon of smoke. Smoke. That crap that's coming out of the smokestacks. It was kind of hard to imagine that that stuff coming out of the smokestacks was actually good for you. Although, by the way, many industrialists tried to make this argument. 1904, the term smog, which used to envelop the LA area in which we live until regulations came into place that reduced it at least somewhat in the 1970s and 1980s, the term smog was coined in 1904 by a London physician who wrote in an editorial to the London Times that there was a natural kind of fog that was created by nature, condensation, but then there was an unnatural kind of fog that was the byproduct of particulate matter that had been thrown into the air and mixed with condensation, thrown into the air from those smokestacks. And this, he suggested, could possibly kill you, suggesting again that progress may be to die for, that those smokestacks, in fact, are not an agent of progress, but of regress, and even perhaps a kind of grim reaper. This coining of the word smog also marked a transformation in a word which we all take for granted and that we think about when we talk about the environment, and that is the word pollution. Pollution. Now, you may not know this. As an historian, I think about how words are transformed by the historical context in which they are used. The historical context of modern industry and of what we call pollution transformed the very word pollution itself. So that, let's say prior, more or less generally, to the industrial era, the idea of pollution was one that referred not to dirty things that human beings were putting into the air or into the environment. It referred rather to moral depravity. Individuals that did not conduct themselves in a way that society considered to be proper. Homosexuals, for example, philanderers and adulterers, murderers and thieves. These people were considered to be a source of pollution, of cultural pollution, moral depravity. With the emergence of an awareness that the things that industry was putting into the environment, that they might actually harm us, there's a shift in the word pollution away from moral depravity and toward the modern definition of pollution as involving things that are contaminating the environment and therefore harming physically human beings. Now, interestingly, this sort of this nuance, this idea of moral depravity is still attached to the idea of modern pollution, so that we see polluters, people who are throwing dirty things into the environment, as also in a sense morally depraved. At any rate, we see a shift in the idea of pollution, which is itself associated with the material things that we are putting into the environment as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Now, there's another shift that occurs. Up until, let's say, the 1860s and 70s, most scientists said that the source of pollution that would endanger human beings in their environment was not man-made, but natural. Not man-made, but natural. So the idea was called miasma theory. What is it that makes people sick? It's the stuff that comes out of wetlands and swamps that creates a kind of fog and descends over people, and this fog is what makes people sick. The solution to this problem that many people saw was drain the swamps, drain the wetlands. And indeed, wherever the Europeans went, and in the New World, what did they do? They drained the wetlands. They drained the swamps, because they felt that this would make human beings healthier. When the Industrial Revolution first began, there was the idea that the stuff coming out of the smokestacks, the particulate matter, actually had a cleansing impact. What it would do is it would clean away the miasma, the filth that came out of the natural world, and make your lives healthier. Now, it was awfully convenient, of course, for industrialists to make this argument. People might be hacking away and coughing as a result of all that crap coming out of the smokestacks, and they would be told, hey, it's making you healthier. It's getting rid of the miasma. But by and by, it became more and more difficult, particularly by the end of the 1800s as industrialization spread and as sicknesses associated with the smoke and the smog spread. It became more and more difficult to convince people that that crap coming out of the smokestacks was actually making you healthy. Increasingly, there was also more and more science to back up the idea that the source of pollution, the source of illness, was not natural, but rather it was man-made. It was precisely that stuff coming out of the smokestacks. And by the way, in order to do something about regulating the smokestacks, you had to see the stuff coming out of them as a problem. So not until the science developed that showed that pollution out of the smokestacks was killing you, not until that happened could you mobilize governments and people to begin to regulate the smoke coming out of the smokestacks. Now, there were a number of things that happened that convinced people that far from being worth it, the smoke coming out of the smokestacks, that this stuff might be killing you. A number of things happened. One of them was a number of death-dealing smogs. In this case, the 1948 Donora smog, which was near Pittsburgh. As a result of a kind of unique climactic event at that particular time, Pittsburgh, of course, was the center of the steel industry. The particulate matter coming out of the smokestacks in the industry of that particular area mixed in a particularly lethal way in 1948, descended upon the town of Donora, Pennsylvania, and a number of people died. And this was a shock to the nation. It was spread across all the newspapers of the United States and elsewhere, and this mobilized public opinion and politicians behind a new campaign to regulate pollution coming out of smokestacks. And indeed, much of the regulation that we take for granted today is a byproduct of this disaster of 1948. In Europe itself, there was a famous smog, the equivalent of the death-dealing smog of Donora, Pennsylvania, a London smog in 1952 that settled over the city. 2,000 people, as many as, or perhaps even more than 2,000 people, suffocated and died as a result of this deadly smog. In the context of Great Britain and Europe, this catalyzed a political movement in a system of regulation in order to reduce the amount of particulate matter in the air.